They threw her clothes into the yard on a Tuesday morning, still damp from the wash line, and 10-year-old Wren Calloway stood in the mud watching her father's new wife fold her arms across the porch railing like she was guarding a castle. "You are not his," Emmeline said. Her voice was flat as creek stone. "I found the letter your mamma hid. You are some drifter's child, and I will not feed another woman's sin under my roof." Wren knew the letter. She had seen her mother clutch it once, years ago, pressing it against her chest the way you hold a wound closed. But her mother was 3 years dead from the fever that swept through Becker's Crossing in the autumn of 1881. And dead women cannot defend their daughters. Her father stood behind the screen door. Wren could see the shape of him, the slope of his shoulders, the coffee cup in his hand. He did not come out. He did not speak. He watched his daughter the way you watch rain through a window, like it was something happening to someone else, entirely. That silence was worse than any words Emmeline could summon. Wren would carry it for years, the specific weight of it, like a stone sewn into her coat lining. She gathered what she could. A wool blanket that smelled of pine pitch and her mother's lavender soap. A tin box of sewing needles. Her mother's seed journal, the pages soft as cloth from years of handling, filled with drawings of plants and careful notes about what grew where and when. And one thing more. A folded piece of paper her mother had tucked inside the journal's back cover, a sketch of a water tower on the ridge above Becker's Crossing, with a single word written beneath it in her mother's careful hand. Safe. The water tower had been condemned since before Wren was born. The railroad company built it in 1869, then abandoned the spur line 2 years later, when the silver deposits turned out to be mostly zinc. It sat on the ridge like a forgotten tooth, its wooden staves weathered to the color of old bone. The town used it as a landmark for giving directions and nothing else. Turn left at the dead tower, people said, as if naming something dead made it true. Wren climbed the ridge that first night with her blanket and her tin box and her mother's journal. The access ladder was rusted, but held. The hatch at the top opened with a sound like a man clearing his throat. Inside the tank was dry and smelled of cedar and iron, the wood still tight enough to block the wind. The floor was solid, 20 feet across, tall enough for a grown woman to stand in, which meant tall enough for a 10-year-old girl to feel like she had discovered a cathedral. She did not cry. She sat against the curved wall and opened her mother's journal and tried to read by the last light coming through the gaps in the staves. She could not make out the words, but she could see the drawings. Her mother had sketched starlings on one page, dozens of them captured in mid-flight, their wings spread in patterns that looked almost like handwriting. Something rustled above her. She looked up. Through the open hatch at the top of the tower, she could see a murmuration of starlings settling onto the iron brace ring that circled the tower's crown. Hundreds of them. They had been roosting here, she realized. The condemned tower was their home, too. She was not alone. That first winter nearly killed her. Not dramatically, not in a single crisis, but in the slow, grinding way that cold and hunger work on a small body. She ate what she could find, wild onions, whose papery skins she peeled with numb fingers, dried service berries she collected in her blanket and stored in the tin box. She trapped a rabbit once, using a snare technique she found diagrammed in her mother's journal hand, drawn with annotations about loop tension and placement near game trails, and she cried while she cleaned it, because the rabbit's eyes were open and dark and trusting. The townspeople knew where she was. A girl living in a condemned water tower on the ridge was not the kind of secret that keeps in a town of 400 souls. Some left food at the base of the ladder in the early weeks, a jar of preserves, a half loaf of bread wrapped in newspaper. But Emmeline Calloway had a sharp tongue and a social ambition that depended on people believing her version of events, and she made it known that charity toward Wren was charity against the Calloway family, and in Becker's Crossing, you did not cross the Calloways. They owned the general store. They extended credit. They could make your winter very long. The food stopped coming. But one person didn't stop. Margaret Osby, the town's sheep shearer, a woman built like a fence post with hands scarred from 1,000 nicks, would leave bundles of raw wool at the base of the tower every few weeks. She never spoke to Wren directly. She never climbed the ladder. She simply left the wool and walked away, her boots crunching on the frost, and Wren would watch her go from the hatch above, this silent woman who smelled of lanolin and tobacco, and who never once looked up, as if acknowledging what she was doing would make it something that could be taken from her. Wren taught herself to use the wool. She packed it between the staves of the tower where the gaps let in wind. She layered it under her blanket. She discovered that raw wool, still oily with lanolin, shed water almost completely, and she fashioned a crude rain cloak from it that kept her dry when the spring storms came. The Starlings stayed. They roosted in the iron crown of the tower each night, and each morning they burst outward in patterns so dense and coordinated that they looked like a single living thing, a dark lung breathing against the sky. Wren began to study them the way her mother had studied seeds. She noticed that their flight patterns changed with the weather. Before rain, they flew low and tight, wheeling in compact spirals. Before clear days, they spread wide and loose, drifting upward in ribbons. Before a hard frost, they did not fly at all. They pressed together on the iron ring and sang a low, churring song that vibrated through the tower walls and into Wren's chest like a second heartbeat. She started feeding them, crumbled service berries, beetle larvae she dug from rotting logs, grain she swept from the ground beneath the loading dock at the Calloway General Store, moving in the blue dark before dawn, quick and silent as the birds themselves. They learned her. They would land on her shoulders, her head, her outstretched arms. Their feet were cold and precise, like tiny sets of pliers. Their feathers up close were not black, but iridescent, shot through with green and purple and bronze, like oil on water. By the time Wren was 12, she had made the tower into something remarkable. She had lined the interior walls entirely with packed wool and mud daub, creating an insulation layer 6 inches thick that held heat the way a kiln holds fire. She had built a small clay stove from river mud, and stones vented through a pipe she fashioned from flattened tin cans she collected from the dump behind the saloon. The pipe ran up through the hatch, and the starlings perched on its warm rim on cold nights, and sometimes she could hear them shifting and murmuring above her like a living roof. She had built sleeping shelves from scrap lumber, a rain collection system using a sheet of oiled canvas stretched across the tower's open top, funneled into a barrel she had rolled up the ridge over 3 days, 20 feet at a time, crying from the effort her hands blistered and raw. She grew herbs in tin cans on the south-facing side of the tower, where the sun hit longest. Sage, thyme, wild mint. She dried them and stored them in the pages of her mother's journal, so the book began to smell less like her mother and more like the ridge, and she did not know whether this made her sad or grateful. The seed journal became her Bible. Her mother had catalogued everything: which roots could be eaten raw, and which needed boiling to leach out the bitterness. How to make a poultice from yarrow and spider web for cuts. How to read weather from the behavior of animals. How to store root vegetables in a sand-filled box to keep them through winter. How to make soap from wood ash and rendered fat. Each entry was written in her mother's careful hand, with small sketches in the margins, and sometimes notes that seemed to be speaking directly to someone. "Remember the Starlings," one entry read. "They know the sky's grammar before we do." Wren thought about that phrase often. The sky's grammar. When she was 14, something changed. She had been tracking the Starlings' flight patterns for 4 years, by then sketching them each morning in a blank section at the back of her mother's journal. She drew what she saw from the hatch at dawn, the shapes the birds made against the pale sky, and over time she had accumulated hundreds of drawings. One evening in late autumn, she spread the drawings out across the floor of the tower, arranging them in sequence, and she felt the hairs on her arms rise. The patterns were not random. They repeated. Not exactly, not like a clock, but in cycles. Certain shapes appeared before certain weather. A tight rising spiral meant a storm within 2 days. A broad eastward sweep meant 3 days of clear sky. A formation she had come to think of as the ribbon, where the flock stretched into a long, undulating line, meant a hard freeze within the week. But there was something else. Something she almost could not bring herself to believe. On certain mornings, usually at the edge of season, changes the Starlings flew in patterns that looked like letters. Not perfect letters, not typeset, but the loose-leaning script of someone writing quickly the way her mother's hand looked in the journal. She had dismissed it for years. Pareidolia, the mind's hunger for meaning in chaos. But when she laid the drawings side by side, the letters formed sequences, and the sequences formed words. She sat in the tower with the drawings around her and read what the Starlings had written in the sky over 4 years. Find the spring. The ridge holds warm water. You will need it when the others cannot help themselves. Wren's hands shook. She told herself it was the cold. She had explored the ridge extensively, but never thought to look for a hot spring. The geology was wrong for it, or so she had assumed. But the next morning she walked the ridge with new eyes, following the Starling's flight path, and she found it in a place she had passed 100 times. A narrow fissure in the rock, hidden behind a fall of dead bramble, where steam rose in thin curls and the air smelled of sulphur and iron. She cleared the bramble and found a pool the size of a horse trough, the water warm enough to redden her skin, fed by a geothermal seam that must have run deep beneath the ridge. The water was mineral-rich and slightly alkaline. She discovered that it kept containers from freezing, even in deep winter, if she filled them at dusk. She piped it into a channel she dug with a broken spade, running it along the base of the tower, and the warmth that radiated from it turned the ground around the tower into a microclimate where things grew weeks earlier than in the valley below. Wild garlic, cress, early strawberries that were small and almost painfully sweet. She was 15 when she found the spring. She was 16 when the Great Freeze of 1888 came to kill Becker's Crossing. It began in January, not with snow but with silence. The bird had stopped singing on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, the temperature had dropped to 20 below zero, and the sky was the color of a bruise, low and heavy and utterly still. Then the wind came. It came from the northwest, and it carried ice in it, not snow but ice, tiny needles of it, that cut exposed skin and blinded horses and drove men to their knees in open fields. The first night, the Hendersons' roof collapsed under the weight of ice accumulation. The second night, the water main that fed the town well froze solid and burst, flooding the main street with water that turned to a skating rink by dawn. The third night, the temperature dropped to 34 below, and the walls of the Callaway General Store cracked down the center, the wood contracting so violently that canned goods fell from shelves and shattered on the floor. Wren watched from the ridge. Her tower was warm. The geothermal water running beneath it kept the ground from freezing, and the insulated walls held the heat from her little clay stove so efficiently that she sat in her nightgown with the starlings clustered on the rim of the stovepipe above her, their collective warmth adding to hers, and she read her mother's journal by candlelight, while the valley below went white and silent as a grave. On the fourth day, a figure appeared at the base of the ladder. Then another. Then 6 more. They came in a ragged line through the snow, wrapped in quilts and horse blankets, their faces raw and red ice in their beards and their eyelashes, and they stood at the bottom of the condemned water tower like penitents at a church door. Wren looked down through the hatch. She recognized them. Calvin March, who ran the feed store, and once told his son not to speak to her because she was a stray. Doris Plimpton, who had organized the church sewing circle that specifically excluded Wren. Old Samuel Crane, who was 78 and had fought in the Mexican War, and who had once spit on the ground when Wren walked past, though he might have been spitting anyway. And others. Families with small children. 2 pregnant women. A man carrying a boy whose feet were wrapped in rags and whose lips were blue. She did not make them beg. She came down the ladder and helped them up one by one, the old people first, then the children, then the rest. It took an hour. The tower was crowded. 23 people in a space meant for water, not human bodies. But it was warm. The steam from the geothermal channel hung in the air and softened the cold in their lungs, and Wren brewed wild mint tea on her clay stove and passed the cup around each person, taking a sip before handing it to the next, and no one spoke for a long time because warmth after deep cold makes you stupid, with relief makes your eyes water and your jaw unclench and your thoughts go soft and loose and grateful. Calvin March was the one who broke the silence. He looked around the interior of the tower at the wool-packed walls and the herb garden and the rain collection system and the stove that drew so cleanly it barely smoked, and he said, "How long you been building this?" 6 years, Wren said. He looked at her. She was 16, thin. Her hair was tangled and her hands were calloused, and there was a scar on her left forearm from where she had burned herself, building the stovepipe. He looked away. "I passed this tower every week going to check my north fence line," he said quietly. "Every week for 6 years. Never once climbed up." "Nobody did," Wren said. And she did not mean it as an accusation. She meant it as a fact, the way you say, "The river runs south," or "The frost comes in October." It was just the shape of things. On the 5th day, Emmeline Calloway came. She came alone. Wren saw her struggling through the drifts on the ridge trail, her coat too thin, her boots, city boots not meant for this. She fell twice. The second time she stayed down for long enough that Wren thought she might not get up. But she did. She made it to the ladder, and she stood there looking up at the hatch, and she did not call out. She just stood. And Wren saw something she had not expected. Emmeline was carrying a bundle against her chest, wrapped in her coat, and the bundle was moving. A baby, maybe 3 months old. Wren had not known Emmeline had a baby. Wren went down the ladder. Emmeline's face was grey, her lips were cracked and bleeding. The baby was alive, but barely warm, its tiny fists clenched, and its cry too weak a sound, like a kitten mewing through a closed door. Emmeline looked at Wren, and in her eyes was something Wren had never seen there before. Not guilt exactly. Something older, the animal knowledge that she had sent a child into the cold, and now the cold was taking hers. She opened her mouth, And what came out was not an apology. It was, "His name is James. He is 6 weeks early, and he will not eat." Wren took the baby. She brought him up the ladder and laid him on warm wool near the stove, and fed him water with a drop of honey from a supply she had been hoarding since autumn. His colour came back in an hour. He began to cry properly, a full-throated, furious sound that made the starlings flutter and rearrange themselves on the pipe above, and several people in the tower laughed because a baby's angry cry in the middle of a freeze that was killing cattle was the most alive sound any of them had heard in days. Emmeline sat in the corner of the tower with her arms wrapped around her knees, and she watched her son being cared for by the girl she had thrown into the mud 6 years earlier. Whatever passed through her mind in that hour, she kept it behind her teeth. She was not a woman built for public reckoning, but when James fell asleep against Wren's chest, warm and milk drunk from a rag soaked in honeyed water, Emmeline closed her eyes, and her chin trembled once, just once, and that was as close to an apology as her body knew how to make. The freeze lasted 9 days. Wren fed 24 people from her stores and her knowledge. She showed them how to melt ice with geothermal water for drinking, how to keep circulation in frost-bitten fingers by submerging them in warm mineral water, not hot warm, because hot water on frozen flesh will kill the tissue, how to stack bodies for shared warmth at night, children in the center, adults on the outside, how to ration dried herbs for tea that kept the gut moving and the spirits from collapsing. On the 7th day, her father came. He stood at the base of the ladder alone, without Emmeline having sent him. Wren looked down at him through the hatch. He was 51 years old, and he looked 70. His hands hung at his sides. He did not say he was sorry. He said, "Your mother would have known what to do." And then quieter, she did know. "She left you the journal." Wren said nothing. "I read the letter," he said. "Emmeline's letter. The one she found. Your mother wrote it to me. She was not confessing anything. She was asking me to take care of the starlings on the ridge. She said they were important. She said they carried messages in the way they flew." He paused. I thought she was losing her mind from the fever. I let Emmeline read it instead of reading it myself. I let Emmeline read it, and I let her turn it into something it was not, and I let you go, because it was easier than fighting her. The starlings erupted from the crown of the tower, startled by a gust of wind, and for a moment they hung in the air above father and daughter, in a shape that looked, if you were inclined to see it, like 2 hands reaching toward each other across an impossible distance. Wren came down the ladder. She did not embrace him. She handed him a cup of mint tea and said, "You can come up. There is room." And there was. When the freeze broke, the town rebuilt. But they rebuilt around the tower, not away from it. They ran the geothermal water into channels that fed a communal greenhouse, the first in the territory, using techniques from Wren's mother's journal. They insulated the new buildings with wool and mud, daub the way Wren had taught them. They built a proper staircase up the ridge to replace the rusted ladder. Wren stayed in the tower. She was offered houses. She was offered the deed to the Callaway store, which Emmeline diminished, and Quiet didn't contest. She turned it all down. She kept her sleeping shelf and her clay stove and her herb garden and her starlings, who returned every evening to roost on the Iron Crown, and every morning flew out in patterns she still sketched in the back of her mother's journal. Years later, when Wren was an old woman, and the tower had been reinforced and painted and declared a historic landmark by the territorial government, a young reporter from Denver came to interview her. He asked her what the starlings had really written in the sky, Was it truly her mother's message, or was it something she had imagined into the shapes, because she needed it to be true? Wren looked at him. She was 72. Her hands were still calloused. She still smelled faintly of wild mint and lanolin. "Does it matter?" she said. The reporter opened his mouth, closed it. Wren poured him a cup of tea. The starlings murmured overhead. Outside the tower, the first snow of the season was falling on a town that had not lost a soul to winter in 56 years, and the steam from the geothermal channels rose through the cold air in thin white ribbons that tangled with the snow and dissolved warm into cold, cold into warm, one thing becoming another, the way a condemned water tower becomes a home, becomes a refuge, becomes the center of a town that almost forgot what it owed to a girl with a tin box and a blanket and a journal full of her dead mother's handwriting. The starlings flew at dawn. They always did. And if you watched closely enough, if you stood on the ridge in the early light, with your breath clouding in front of you, and your hands shoved deep in your coat pockets, you could almost read what they wrote. Almost. The message was always the same, or maybe it changed every day, or maybe it was never a message at all, but just the ordinary miracle of 10,000 small hearts beating in unison against a cold sky, drawing shapes that meant whatever you most needed them to mean. Wren never said which it was. She just watched them fly every morning until the morning she did not. And the town buried her on the ridge beside the tower, with a headstone that bore no epitaph, only a carving of a single starling in flight, its wings spread wide, its beak open mid-song.